It's chucking it down with rain. Can you hear it? And the birds' song too. It's a perfect day to do a little bit of crafting. And if you love things crafting, all things flower arranging, and a spot of charity shopping too, why don't you consider subscribing to my channel? All you need to do is hit the red button marked subscribe, and that means next time you open the YouTube app on your phone, your laptop or your computer, one of my videos will be waiting for you. Join me today as I show you how to make this gorgeous rag wreath. It's the biggest one I've ever made, and also I've completed it in record-breaking time. I like to do my crafting sitting at the kitchen table. There's plenty of space and lots of natural daylight. And for my rag wreath today, I'm going to be using a straw wreath base. And if you're a connoisseur on making fresh flower or perhaps artificial or dried flower wreaths, you probably recognise this. And if it's new to you, I'll leave a link to it in the description underneath the video. I went for a wreath, I think it was 40 centimetres in diameter, just to make it a little bit bigger than the more usual size of 30 centimetres. Over the last few months, I've been collecting some fabric to use for my rag wreath. I have got here 2 batik style napkins. They came from a flower festival as a set of 6, and I've given 2 each to my crafting friends. I've also got a couple of tea towels. One of them, the stripy one, was from my own collection, and the other one, I don't know if you spotted, was actually a wedding invitation, and I found that in a charity shop in Tenterden here in Kent. And if you love all things charity shopping, I'll leave a link to my thrift haul playlist in the description underneath the video so you can catch up with my thrifting adventures. Now, as you can see by the rotary cutter and the board and my green cutting board, my original plan was to cut squares of fabric very precisely. But having decided that I wanted to cut off the hems around my napkins and my tea towels, I've decided to go for the ripped look. So I'm just taking a sharp pair of scissors, my fabric scissors, which I only ever use for fabric and nothing else, and I am making a sharp snip and then ripping off the edges, and this has given me a frayed look, which I'm quite happy with. Now, if the frayed look isn't your look, you might want to be more precise and do all your cutting with a sharp pair of fabric scissors or a rotary cutter, or perhaps even using pinking shears. The next thing I'm thinking about is how big I'm going to make my squares. So this is a rag wreath made a slightly different way to previous rag wreaths that you might have seen me making, either here on my YouTube channel or in my free Facebook group, Flower Start World. Conventionally, you would probably have cut strips of fabric and then knotted them onto a wire wreath frame. The kind of wreath frame that you might have used if you were making a very traditional Christmas door wreath, where you were adding moss on first. I've also previously made rag wreath door wreaths using a polystyrene base and then pinned on short sections of freshly or brand new ribbon rather than recycling. So as you can see there, I'm actually going to be cutting out squares and using my scissors to punch the fabric into my straw wreath base. And the first thing I needed to do was decide how big I wanted to cut my squares. Before I started the project, I had in mind that my squares were going to be 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres, and then once I got my ruler out and just had thinking about the size of my wreath, I thought that 15 centimetres would be a better size. If you're using a smaller wreath frame, perhaps you've got a 30 centimetre wreath frame in your stash, it may be that you might want to cut 1 or 2 squares first of all before you commit to your own sizes, and perhaps even scale down to that 10 centimetres. So what I've managed to do with each of my napkins is I have ripped it into 3, and then I've been able to make 3 squares across each of those lengths. So my napkins have given me 9 squares of fabric, and you just need to get into the swing of this and depending on how carefully you like to work, you'll be measuring precisely, but I just wanted squares that were approximately 15 centimetres in diameter. And as luck would have it with my tea towels, from memory, again, I stripped these down into 3 lengths, and then from each of those 3 lengths, I got 4, it might have been 5. I can't remember now whether I got 12 squares out of my tea towels or 15. My tea towels weren't exactly dividable by 15 for each of my squares. So what I did when I came to the last one, I just guesstimated. I didn't want to be left with any leftover bits of fabric. And once your fabric is in the wreath, I don't think you're going to be able to tell that some were marginally larger than the others. One thing to be aware of, if you are ripping your fabric seams, you will get this natural frayed edge. But of course you do get all the bits of cotton fraying off too. So you might want to, once you've done all your ripping, is just to tidy up and pull those loose threads out of the way. And if you find when you're actually working that the fabric is fraying more, just take a pair of scissors just to cut off the loose ends. Much easier to do any pulling of the fabric though, getting rid of those frayed edges, the loose threads, while you're at this stage where your squares are flat. Because if you try and pull the threads once they're in the door wreath, you're going to end up pulling your squares out of the wreath base, and you don't want to be undoing any of your work. So here I am cutting up the last of my tea towels with the traditional blue edge, and then I end up with the central section, which is just white fabric. So you can see here I've tried to be quite careful about my fabric selection. I've stuck to blue and white, the sort of chinoiserie look, and of course you can choose any colourway that you like. So let's get on with starting the wreath. Now, if you have made a traditional door wreath before, you have probably used this kind of technique in terms of deciding where your placement of your materials are going to go. If I was making this wreath using foliage, I would have started at the top and added my foliage in until I completed a whole circle. But because I'm not quite sure how many of these fabric squares I'm going to need, I'm going to use them as if they were the decoration to a wreath. Think back to when you made your Christmas door wreath. You probably put all your pine and your ivy and your foliages on first, and then you came back in with your decorations. I like to get 5 key anchor points in, never 4, because that gives you a very square look to your door wreath. So I put the 5 main anchor points in with my more vibrant petite napkin, and then I'm coming in with my next fabric. So I like to layer up. So you can see here I'm just having a bit of a struggle that not only had I punched that fabric in at the side, I'd also caught one of the loose edges too. But from this close up here you can see exactly what I'm doing. I'm aiming my scissors into the centre of the fabric and then pushing it down, and it does hold a gentle tug of the fabric and it won't come out. But what I quite like about this technique is if I decide that I want to freshen things up and change things, or perhaps make the door wreath bluer and not to have so much of the white elements in it, I could simply tug out the fabric and then I would be able to iron them flat and use them for another project and substitute other colours of fabric in. But they do hold firm, and if you're worried about it, the thing to do, as I always advise when you're making a door wreath, is to give it a shake. And if you find at this stage it's working loose, you either need to drill down a bit more with your scissors to really lock that fabric into place, or you might consider using a glue gun and gluing the fabric in place. I didn't want to do that because I didn't want the mess of it and then the more time-consuming element of waiting for my glue gun to heat up and having to be within arm's distance of an electric socket. And I found it worked quite well without glue. So if you decide that your fabric isn't secure enough, let me know how you get on using a glue gun. So you can see what I was doing here is layering up. I started off with the anchor point of the batik napkin and then came in with my stripy tea towel. I then layered up with the wedding invitation tea towel. And then what I'm starting to do now is basically to fill up the gaps. So I'm not always repeating the collection of the fabric squares. I'm just using those original 5 placements to give me a starting point. And like a little garden, the fabric sort of grew around those 5 anchor points until the whole wreath was covered up. I'm then going back in with my surplus fabric, so I'm adding in here a little bit more of the blue, and just where I see a gap or where I think the wreath looked a little bit too white or pale, I'm adding in another piece of the fabric. So it's always a good idea when you're working on your door wreaths is to have it upright at some point so you can see what it looks like from a distance. And I've decided here that actually I need some more fabric. So I've managed to find, I think this was a baby sheet from a cot when my daughter was little. It's a cotton sheet. I've taken off the hemmed edges again, and I am working through ripping down. I'm only ripping 1 column of fabric at a time because I don't want to rip up too many squares and then find I'm not going to be able to use them. And I'm just thinking here, can I use these raw edges for anything else? And what I've decided to do is I'm going to make a plait, and I'm going to plait the surplus fabric, the rubbishy bits that would have gone in the bin, so I can use that as a door wreath hanger. Now I know that this door wreath is going to go on my front door, which has a central glazed window in it. So my hook for hanging my door wreaths is visually too high, so I always have to hang my door wreaths on a length of ribbon so they hang down at the right height. So this is what I'm doing here, plaiting my scrap fabric together. This would have been a lot easier if I had someone to hold the end of the plait for me, or whether if I'd had a bit of tape, I could have taped it to the kitchen table. And what I've done here actually in the end was tied it around the back of my kitchen chair just to give me a little bit of tension so I could plait more easily. And what you can't see me doing here is I ended up adding in some extra lengths of fabric. I decided that the plaited rope that I made wasn't quite long enough. So what I did do with a slightly longer cord was I looped it in half and then tucked the cut ends through the loop and tied a knot, and then shuffled it all round so you couldn't see the finished knot. The knot is hidden amongst the rest of my pieces of fabric. So I'm going back in with that last lot of white fabric. I was a bit of, to be honest, in 2 minds about it. It was quite a crisp white compared to the duller white of my 2 tea towels, which were probably not so much a cream, but more of an ivory off-white colour. And what I'm doing here with the finished wreath is just having one last look at it, making sure that I've covered in the edges of the wreath. Remember that your wreath has a top side, and it's also got an outer edge too, so you might want to add in either more fabric scraps or just use your scissors and punch in some of the leaves of those fabric squares just to cover up your wreath edges. And the reason I went for blue and white, well, I've been collecting these blue and white plates and I'm trying to decide whether to add those on as extra decoration. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching today's video. And if you decide to use the same technique that I did for making my rag wreath, I'd love to see how you get on. Why don't you tag me on Instagram? I'm Flowerstart with an underscore at the end. Or better still, join my free Facebook group. Search Flowerstart World or click the link in the description underneath this video. And talking about joining things, why don't you consider becoming a member of my YouTube channel? All you need to do is click the description underneath the video and find the join button. And the advantage of joining is that you get early access to my Monday uploads and also free access to my online flower arranging club. Well, that's all from me for now, and I'll see you again next time.